let's start off by folks just, if you want, raise your hand. What's a principle that you've been thinking about a lot or that you care for us to throw up on the board?
Self-sufficiency.
Self-sufficiency.
Observation. Observe.
Yeah. Observation is probably like the overarching principle because it underpins everything else. If you don't have attuned mind and eyes to the rest of the world, then it'll be hard to learn much else or accept any feedback from the rest of the system. Accept feedback. So a principle I really like is start where you are. At least from my frame, it seems if you can work where you are already and do the most good that you can there, then you'll be able to replicate your successes and learn from your failures in that exact situation, no matter where you go. That's one I like to throw out. Start where you are.
Principles kind of are framed in by the ethics. So earth care, people care, and then does anybody know what the last return of surplus? That's right. Another aspect of it is return to surplus, and it's also redistribution of wealth and resources. So returning the surplus to the land base, and then there's also redistributing the wealth that you generate, sharing it with other people that don't have it as much. So especially because we live in a society, the capitalist mind frame is really the complete opposite of starting with ethics. Not only should we be the best stewards of the land that we have to use, that we can be, but we should also strive to use the least amount of land to leave as much wild as possible and really use the area that we have to use as efficiently as we can. When you are trying to implement these principles on the landscape or on your homestead or on your project or whatever, those ethics are just there in the background as a kind of guide for you. It's like, is what I'm doing going to benefit just me and not the ecosystem? Or, does this have potential to help return surplus? They're just basically, they're kind of meant as guides, you know what I mean?
Waste is an underused resource, or you could say unused resource.
Which is also the fact that the problem is the solution. It's pretty much a different way to say that.
Is everyone gathering that these principles are all sort of nested and interwoven? Is there a principle within what I just said? So interconnection's big.
For example, what do we try to do with, the waste that we were just talking about, or water, or solar energy? What do you try to do to them or with them?
Capture and store.
Yes.
No catchment.
And that can come in a whole variety of ways. We can put out a ton of bird feeders so that all the free phosphorus that's flying around in the air, hopefully some of it lands on this site. A very clear reductionist picture of this is how much energy is coming into the site through solar radiation or whatever. But there is a really lot of truth to the fact that then, the yields might be somewhat close to unlimited because there's always another type of connection that you can make between elements in a system. So, maybe we have maxed out every bit of absorption of solar radiation, but then there's fungi and they can, still make more yields without using sun. The limit to it is probably the management issue that we've been talking about this whole time.
I think it's a nice principle because it helps to unbound I only have an acre, so I can only grow this much stuff. I can only produce this much corn every year. We could just say diversity.
And redundancy, isn't it?
How did you word that? Integrate?
Rather than segregate.
Integrate. Yeah. How about obtain a yield? Anyone hear that one? What's the point of going out and doing anything if it's just gonna end up yielding nothing? And is that true? Can you actually do something and have no yield? Is it even possible? The thing with principles is, feel free to make your own up. How about that one? Use edges, value marginal. That's a good one. What does that mean in the wild food context? There's many, many species that pretty much only occupy edge ecosystems. They're not suited to either, a full canopy or open.
And edge has really been one of the driving forces in terms of the designing the swale here. Like Ben was saying, the whole idea is that you have strips of trees with diversity of plantings from south to north, and in between that we have strips of pasture. So we might have all types of edge effects there, and we have basically created in profile this kind of curve that allows for a lot more sunlight capture than just a one-dimensional plane. We've extended the edge of that photosynthetic surface. Instead of just 1 acre of grass, we have multiple acres of photosynthetic surface in the same ground area.
Designing from patterns to details, climate analogs, as Ben talked about last night. That's a big pattern. You know, what sort of species occupy this broad climatic range across the planet?
And some of the patterns that we want to start the design with can also be, through time, you know, 4-dimensional. So think of like succession as a pattern. So it's not just that we want to plant certain species that we think fit in this climate. It's also that we want to have a succession of different species that would mimic the type of succession that we see going from, say, an old field to a forest here. Herbaceous plants and woody perennials that come into the system through time, and then try to see what can we replace with ones that are more useful to us, and plan for that same type of successional pattern. One of the patterns of going, you know, short to tall as we go north, well then which species are we going to really fill that? That's the pattern, and then the species that we fill it with are the details, and the planting spaces and those things are the details.
The way David Holmgren has worded the observational principle is observe and interact. So we have the passive observation. I'm looking out here, I'm taking note of what I see. And then there's the active. Okay, I see this. Now what happens if I do this? Who's heard the saying, you know, you should spend a year on a piece of land or more just observing? Who's heard that?
Yeah, right.
So who's actually done it? You look at around the world and you're like, do I even have, like, do I have a year to spend like just looking at this place? Right. There's many ways you could interpret this, but so you can spend a year observing, but you'll probably learn a lot faster if you interact in some capacity. I like that principle because it's like you have to balance your observation with some sort of interaction. I think the take-home message is just go out and do something out there, because that's how you're really going to learn the most, is by having a physical connection, and you'll build a relationship with that piece of land or that whatever it is. It doesn't have to be land, it could be anything. A principle that Sim van der Rin, who wrote the book Ecological Design, one of his principles was make it visible, because if you can make your ecological design effort visible, like if you could see that orchard, then you're more likely to go out to the orchard and see how it's doing. Say you're developing this farm system and you make it visible to other farmers, then they're more likely to come and learn about it and maybe change their practices. So multiple functions, stacking functions.
So there's the idea that every element we want to get multiple functions out of it through interconnectedness. And to make it clear, I mean, a lot of us do all of these things all the time, but we just don't necessarily, you know, focus on the fact that we are doing that.
Multiple elements that perform multiple functions, and then multiple functions served by or performed by multiple elements. Does that make sense? You have many elements that serve a single function, and then each of those elements has many functions itself. You know, we don't just have the Humanure toilet, which is helping us approach no waste, but then we could also, you know, produce hot water from it. We're also producing fertility. Relative location, this is a big one. Relative location. So we just went on a tour and Ben was talking about zones of use.
Yeah, the things that need to have the most continual maintenance are, you know, beans need to be picked every day or two. They're right over there. The potatoes we're just going to basically pick 2-3 times, and then we'll be done with it. So that can be farther away.
So the whole purpose of this is now we have this toolbox of principles that we can use to inform all of our decision making as we move forward throughout this course, and then as everyone leaves and goes on to their life and project or whatever it may be, you can draw on this information or these insights so that as you make decisions, you're not like flying in the dark. You can, you know, place things with relative location and make sure that they're connected to each other and make sure that they serve multiple functions and have.
Anytime I find myself in a situation that isn't comfortable or isn't working, that's when I try to think, is there really a principle that I could try to apply here? You know, like if you're trying to tend part of the garden and you find yourself just, you know, it just doesn't work quite physically, like logistically, like you can't, you know, access a certain area, what type of principle would be valuable for me to try to apply here so that I don't have to be, you know, in this weird, awkward position trying to like weed around something?